I'd like to address myself to this idea of adaptation to the information age. We seem to be inundated with factoids and events, the various kinds of information through the technology that we have. And it's hard to put this stuff, to make sense out of this stuff and to put it in context. And there is a tendency to be overwhelmed or confused. And I talked about last time the idea that we're in a period where we need to adapt to this sort of paradigm shift to an information-centric society, and how human beings have always been able to adapt to their environment. But this kind of an environment is certainly a challenge. We could say that the industrial age created challenges of adaptation, but I think the information age presents a kind of adaptation that we haven't seen before, anything quite like it. And so I want to speak a little bit about what that presents us with. One of the things that I think is going on is that we've been conditioned in certain ways by our culture, by the education system, whatever it may be, by the media, to believe that that we're sort of incapable of understanding or incapable of knowing what's happening in an intelligent and circumspect way. There's been a kind of dumbing down. We've heard about this for years, the dumbing down of society, and to some degree I think this is true, whether it's intentional or not. It's kind of like this illustration here with the elephant. A baby elephant, when it's first born and begins to walk around, if you put it on a chain or tie it so that it can't move, it'll struggle like crazy for quite some time because it wants to get away. But at some point in time it learns that it just is not going to be able to break that chain or break that rope. And then as the elephant grows older, you can eventually use a very small rope to restrain the elephant because he has come to accept the fact that he cannot escape. And I think this idea that we are dependent on experts, we're dependent on an elite class of an intelligentsia, so to speak, is a conditioned situation where we are put in a situation where we feel that we can't, we're incapable, we're too stupid, we're too ignorant, we're too ill-informed, whatever it may be, to have a well-informed and intelligent perspective on things. And to some degree this is not untrue. There's a lack of education or natural curiosity or the ability of people to, or the desire of people to expand their mental capability or their mental state. I talked last time about the idea that to learn and to be able to think more effectively throughout our lives, we build a scaffold, so to speak, of ideas, of concepts. And this is what happens when you're educated, when you go to school, or whether you're self-educated, whether you read books and you spend a lot of time learning things. You're taking all of these different ideas and they begin to connect. They begin to make sense as you tie different ideas and their relevance together. But the idea that most people feel that they're kind of incapable of advancing beyond a certain point, I think is a little bit of a misleading situation. Genetic intelligence, or the disposition to study and to learn and to be able to integrate various ideas, is not just is really not the main factor. We really can learn and develop and become much more competent in this way than most of us think. I think of most of the perception of intelligence when we see experts, We see people that write the books and that give the speeches and that talk on television. Yes, I'm sure there are certain people that are highly intelligent and maybe born with an innate capacity that maybe the majority don't have. But it doesn't mean that most of us can't do a lot more to bring ourselves up to a level that is comparable to where these people are. Just the ability to be glib and to speak fluently and to basically entertain people, and like we see in public figures, a lot of this is just an innate ability to sort of draw people to us and to entertain people, but it isn't necessarily an indication of great intelligence or wisdom or insight. So as we, for myself, I know I at some point in my young life decided that I was more intelligent than I'd been led to believe, that I actually had an interest in a lot of different things, and a lot of that was discouraged, and I had been discouraged from branching out into learning a lot of things and exercising my own curiosity about things. And over the years, I went to school. I did have formal education, but most of my real learning, I think, was self-learning. And most education is self-learning. You can't just go someplace and have that poured into you. You have to basically invest your own interest, your own energy, your own curiosity into the learning process. And I learned a lot of things about science and literature and politics and history on my own. And a lot of this has been helpful throughout my life in taking these various ideas and tying them together. But it's also important to have some variety. We need to be able to discipline ourselves to learn things. If you want to learn, you really have to read. And if you're going to read, you have to focus on the material at hand. This is even in college. If you're given a textbook or you're given reading materials, you have to spend the time and the effort to read that material for understanding and commit yourself to that. And the same goes true for life after your formal education. If you want to learn something of substance, you will have to devote some time and some discipline into that process. If you want to read, so let's say, about the American Revolution, there's books with tremendous amount of historical information that taken from original sources. You can read things like the Federalist Papers. But to read these things isn't so much a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of discipline and interest and time. And so a lot of that is something that we can do if we have the focus to do it. Nonetheless, variety is important. You really want to be able to, you can't just sit and read historical nonfiction, information, day in and day out for months and months and months. We do need variety. The brain needs variety, and it's always good to take a break and to do other things. Read a book about science. Read a book about, just read novels. Read, fiction, whatever it may be. But having some variety is certainly important, and we need to be kind of sensitive to what our brain can tolerate without essentially kind of going numb. I think a lot of the lack of informed people, the percentage of people that are not as well informed in terms of history, is in a way, it's kind of we've been robbed of our historical memory. We have the information. We live in an age when all this information is available. We can certainly get books, any book we want, for a reasonable price. I get a lot of books on Amazon. I buy them used, and you'll get books, high quality books, even though they're older. The material itself is still accurate and still well worth reading, and you can get hardcover books and so on at a very inexpensive price. And yet we've been led down the path of thinking that these things are irrelevant, that they don't really mean anything anymore, that the world is so much different and so on. And I argue this is not really the case. History is not something that is, for example, dull or reserved only for people, bookworms or intelligent people or educated people. This is just not true. And we've allowed ourselves to kind of be convinced that this is the case, like the elephant. Another challenge is that we are in the information age with this technology. There is a tremendous amount of distraction, and we have become addicted to novelty. So we want something new, we want something short, we want something, you know, that we can just read it and move on. So we get all this information through social media, through various web pages and so on, but none of it has depth. And we've kind of allowed ourselves to be drawn down that path where we're not focused. And we've allowed, you know, a lot of these venues, their goal is to grab our attention and keep our attention. And to a large extent, we have to force ourselves away from that in order to have the time and to have the brain cycles to really get deeper into substantial material and to focus on that. Few people seem to read anymore, read books. Certainly, even less people read nonfiction books, historical books, books about, you know, the founding ideas, whether it's philosophy, whether it's the constitutional framework, whether it's the founding fathers and the whole ideas, the realm of ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. A lot of this about our country certainly isn't something that people spend a lot of time reading. But there's great material out there. If you want to understand, for example, what happened at the time of the Revolution, there's really two ways to look at it. There's before the Revolution, before 1776, maybe 10 years before that, or even 100 years before that, and what was leading up to the fact that they would actually declare independence. And then you have everything after 1776, which was the War of Independence itself. You had the development of the Constitution, and you had the ratification of the Constitution. And then, of course, you had the things after that. But this was the founding of the country, and really a revolutionary change in the thought of how free people can live in a society and in a republic where liberty is the primary value. In this, you know, information age, as I mentioned, another challenge is this idea that it's almost impossible to keep our sanity and continue being involved with all of this information, issues, input that we have, whether it's from television or radio or podcasts or YouTube. All these things, there's all of the confusion and lack of ability to make sense out of all of it, so that a lot of people just say, that's enough, I'm just going to withdraw. And yet I think that it's important to realize that how we live as human beings is, we don't live in isolation. We can't live in isolation. I'm as much a curmudgeon as anybody, and yet I understand the need to interact with the outside world. I have to push myself to do it at times, and yet what's going on in the world around us, we are part of that. We have a role in what's happening in society, the ability to grasp issues, to form our own opinions, to work with others and share and exchange ideas. This is part of how we keep our society free, and how we identify and build a consensus. So if we just withdraw and we maintain a kind of an isolated posture, then we're not going to be able to maintain our liberty, and we're not going to be able to protect our liberty or identify issues and deal with issues. I think for young families, young people in general, but young families especially. It's very difficult to find the time, to find the focus, especially with these other external factors, but just the busyness of life, especially when you're working, you've got children, you've got other things that you're doing. It's really hard to focus on doing the things that involve intellectual or learning ideas, or improving our knowledge of what's going on. And so it does take discipline, and it does take effort, and it will take time. And so something I've learned in my life after 60 years is that I wish I had done maybe a little more focus on the issues of freedom, the issues of watching what's going on in the realm of government, and how our rulers are actually doing things, and at least having a little more part in that process, rather than just basically withdrawing, living my own life, just pursuing things that might be of some tangential interest to me, but don't really have any effect on the society and the world in which I live. I want to start by taking a few minutes to talk about the pre-revolutionary period in America. This was from 1660 through 1676 or 1776. The real important part that was accelerating us towards independence was really from 1760 to 1776, about a 16-year period. But it's good to go back even further and look at, even from the beginning, what the people that came to America were seeking. I think most of the records and most of the historians agree that people that were coming over here in most cases were seeking to escape a pretty much hidebound religious, economic, and political society in Britain. There was just no real opportunity to advance if you weren't in a certain class of society or in a certain area. That you couldn't really have property, you really couldn't develop a future. So I think there was a lot of this seeking of liberty, even though they may not have thought of it in that exact term, was kind of an underlying mindset that was behind this. And so when the people came here, they sought those kinds of freedoms were kind of built into their whole idea of their reason for existence to coming here. And so this became part of the DNA, the part of the culture of American society right from the beginning. The other thing that was going on at that time in the British Empire was essentially built on this idea of mercantilism. And this was the concept of creating an empire in which trade, you would basically control trade in and out of the empire. You would control trade in and out of your colonies, and then they would use various kinds of taxes and so on, and other administrative mechanisms to control what kinds of goods came in and out. Over time, the problem with taxes and what we hear about with the Boston Tea Party and all of that, this was an important part of what was going on in the colonies, but it wasn't just a matter of monetary issues. There was a matter of control, and there was a matter of self-governance. Going back to 1651, you had the first of this navigation acts. The Dutch had been competing with England in trade and in finance, and had actually been winning that battle. So the English enacted this Navigation Act's first version of this in order to control trade and be able to compete a little more successfully with the Dutch. The Dutch were very sharp at finance. They were very sharp at mercantilism themselves, and so they were outperforming the English. In 1660, which is about 9 years later, um, there was this new sort of comprehensive trade navigation and trade act that Britain enacted, and they called it the Grand Palladium, or the Magna Carta of English commerce. And this prohibited all trade, or regulated all trade, in not only from the Dutch but from any country outside the empire. So generally speaking, all trade had to go through Britain, between the colonies and the outside world. There was some external trade was allowed from other countries, from the Spanish or the French or other countries, but they would have to go through Britain first. And even there, if they weren't goods that the British needed or that the British didn't already have in some part of their empire, then they would prohibit that product from being traded. The acts of trade and navigation through all of these years, from 1660 on, were really not, they were upheld to the last, but during that time they were not enforced in any serious way. The Americans pretty much could get around them when they needed to or wanted to. There wasn't a strong governance through the British representation here in the colonies, and so smuggling was fairly easy, and circumventing these rules as to where you could trade and who you could trade with was more or less the British looked the other way, or they were pushed in such a way that they basically gave in, and they allowed a lot of these rules to be violated. There were exceptions even for the South. For example, they could trade certain products pretty much with anybody they wanted to, and so on. So there was a lot of this kind of looking the other way, and there was pretty much a policy of what they called salutary neglect. In other words, they were just basically allowing things to go on their own way, because it wasn't really hurting anybody that much, and there really wasn't any harm being done in the short run. The problem came in 1754, so this was, a good 20 years before the Revolution. There was the French and Indian War, and this was the French colonies, or French presence in North America, along with the Indians, and there was a war between those two entities at that time, and it was basically on the American frontier. The British were trying to requisition men and money and other resources for this war, because the colonies were part of Britain. They felt that they should be holding up their end of the deal. After all, it was protecting our frontier and so on. But the Americans didn't really want to invest in that. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of extra resources, and there just had been a feeling that they didn't have an obligation to do this. They felt that this was Britain's responsibility as the mother country. Through this process, England actually drained a lot of their treasury. There was a lot of investment or monetary resources to actually defend the frontier and to defend the country, so to speak, the colonies at that time. And there were also issues in the country having to do with currency. We didn't have enough currency. They had to come up with their own currency, which was a violation of the rules. And so there were some conflicts about that issue, and it pretty much was a matter of England just didn't care. They would, if we had problems, we were just sort of left to fend for ourselves. And along that time, I think there was an increasing anger and bad blood right after the French and Indian War. There was a lot of increased tensions between the American colonies and Britain, having to do with their attitude towards the colonies. They treated them as second-class citizens. They found them kind of despicable or deplorable, uncouth, and this really began to have a real tension between the two societies. There was also a lot of building tension over the way that the mother country controlled the economy. Pretty much the South was controlled by the merchant class and especially by means of debt, the way that debt was managed, they managed to keep control of what was going on and during the fluctuations and so on in the economy. The South was always basically ended up being hand to mouth. And so over time that began to increase tensions between the two. Well, that's about all I have time for. I was going to go in a little bit on the political side, what was going on we were talking about the economic and financial aspects of the relationship between Britain and pre-revolution. But you also had the governance, so you had the assemblies which were elected, and you had the governor and councils that were British, basically British representation, and the relationship between those two and how things developed in that arena. But we'll get to that next time and go into that a little bit more. Before we go into the inception of the real clash that happened with the Boston Tea Party and subsequent things that led to the actual Declaration of Independence.